Long before tech behemoths like Apple, Google, and Amazon appeared on the scene, one of the largest and most powerful companies in history was in operation. On December 31st, 1600, the English East India Company was established by royal license. Over the next 2 centuries, it operated as a hybrid nation-state and trading organization, making enormous profits from commerce with countries like Indonesia, China, India, and Persia. Its enterprise brought cheap tea, cotton fabrics, and spices to England at a brisk price, and its investors in London were handsomely rewarded with returns of up to 30%. At its peak, the English East India Company was by far the largest corporation of its kind. It was also larger than several nations. It was essentially the de facto emperor of large portions of India, which was one of the most productive economies in the world at that point. However, the East India Company discovered a new vocation as an empire builder in the late 18th century, just as its hold on trade began to wane. This massive conglomerate once had a private army of 260,000 soldiers, which was twice the size of the British Army in existence. With such force, the company was able to drive out the remaining rivals, seize territory, and force the rulers of the Indian subcontinent into unfair agreements that gave it the authority to impose heavy taxes. Without the East India Company, there would be no imperial British Raj in India in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the wild success of the world's first multinational corporation helped shape the modern global economy, for better or worse. East India Company founded under Queen Elizabeth I. A group of London merchants received a license from Queen Elizabeth I on the very last day of 1600, granting them exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies, a vast region that stretched from the Cape of Good Hope in Africa eastward to Cape Horn in South America. The Dutch East Indies Company, established in 1602, as well as the Spanish and Portuguese, who already had trading outposts in India, posed a serious threat to the newly established English East India Company, which was a monopoly in the sense that no other British people could lawfully trade in that region. England had a taste for exotic Eastern commodities like jewels, textiles, and spices, much like the rest of Western Europe did. However, sea travel to the East Indies was an extremely dangerous undertaking, fraught with lethal illnesses like scurvy and armed conflicts with rival traders. The startling 30% employee death rate was experienced by East India Company workers. The London merchants were at least shielded from domestic competition by the monopoly provided by the Royal Charter, which also ensured a bribe for the Crown, which was desperately short of cash. The East India Company was the first to popularize many of the characteristics that define a contemporary business. For instance, the business raised and pooled cash by selling shares to the general public, making it the biggest and most established joint stock business of its time. In addition to a president, there was a board of control, or board of officers, in charge. The East India Company held boisterous board meetings that were attended by hundreds of stockholders, in contrast to the rather formal corporate board meetings of today. Furthermore, although having an apparent monopoly in India thanks to its charter, the East India Company permitted its staff members to carry out side business in private trading. The company had to offer additional incentives at first because it didn't have much money to compensate its workers for this extremely risky activity. That incentive was to trade for their own private interest overseas. Employees of the East India Company would trade both within and outside of the rules that the company granted. There were so many opportunities to fudge, cheat, and smuggle. Think about jewelry, which is a very small and very expensive thing that you can hide on yourself easily. East Indies trade fueled consumer culture. The majority of English clothing before the East India Company was made of wool and was intended for functionality rather than style. However, this started to change when low-cost, exquisitely woven cotton textiles from India, whose various regions created cloth with unique colors and designs, entered British markets. On the streets of London, a new pattern would come along and take center stage. There's this possibility of being in the right style that hadn't existed before. A lot of historians think this is the beginning of consumer culture in England. Once they brought over the cotton goods, it introduced this new volatility in what was popular. In India, trade and politics blend. Upon their arrival in India, European traders such as the British had to gain the favor of the indigenous monarchs and rulers, particularly the influential Mughal Empire that ruled over much of the country. The East India Company was a private company, but it had political clout because to its royal charter and well-trained workforce. Indian emperors courted local company leaders, extorted money from them, and enlisted the company's strength in local conflicts, occasionally pitting them against Dutch or French commerce companies. Coastal cities were more vulnerable to foreign influence since the Mughal Empire centered its power in the interior of India. The East India Company's initial goal of acquiring and constructing fortified trading outposts in port towns like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta was one of the reasons it required such a large amount of pooled finance. As a result of internal conflict following the fall of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, many Indian traders relocated to these company-run coastal mini-kingdoms. The problem was, how would the East India Company rule these territories, and by what principle? A company is not a state. A company ruling in the name of the crown cannot happen without the crown's consent. Sovereignty became a big problem. In whose name will the company devise laws? The local branch officer of the East India Company was the response in the majority of situations. The company's London office was unconcerned with Indian politics. Roy claims that the board was content and didn't step in as long as trade went on. It was left to the branch officer to draft the laws governing company cities like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, as well as to establish local police forces and judicial systems, due to the low level of communication between London and the branch offices. For example, a letter took 3 months to get back and forth. This would be the equivalent of ExxonMobil drilling for oil in coastal Mexico, taking over a major Mexican city using private armed guards, and then electing a corporate middle manager as the mayor, judge, and executioner. From Mercantile Company to empire building. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked a significant turning point in the East India Corporation's development from a successful commercial corporation into an established empire. In this engagement, 3,000 company forces faced off against 50,000 Indian warriors under the command of the Nawab of Bengal. The company's attempt to evade taxes infuriated the Nawab. However, the Nawab was unaware that Robert Clive, the military commander of the East India Company in Bengal, had made a secret agreement with Indian financiers, which prevented the majority of the Indian army from participating in the Plassey battle. After Clive's triumph, Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India at the time, was given extensive taxation powers by the East India Company. Clive looted the treasure from the Nawab and sent it back to London, making sure he kept a large portion for himself. This completely changes the company's business model from one that had been focused on profitable trade to one that focused on tax collection. That's when it became a really damaging institution. In 1784, the British Parliament passed Prime Minister William Pitt's India Act, which formally included the British government in ruling over the East India Company's land holdings in India. When this act came into being, the company ceased to be a very significant trade power, or a significant governing power in India. The proper British Empire took hold. The Opium Wars and the end of the East India Company. The East India Company's adventures didn't stop in India. The company traded tea, the most valuable trade product in China, for opium during one of its worst periods. China only exchanged tea for silver, and as silver was scarce in England, the company used a clandestine market of Indian smugglers and producers to circumvent China's opium restriction. Millions of Chinese men wasted away in opium dens, while the company's investors became wealthy as tea flooded into London. The Opium War of 1840 began when the British government dispatched warships in response to China's crackdown on the opium trade. Hong Kong was given to the British after the East India Company was humiliated and defeated, but the battle also exposed the company's unscrupulous business practices. Adam Smith's pro-free market views propelled parliamentary resistance to the East India Company's monopoly status by the middle of the 19th century. The East India Company's death in the 1870s was ultimately caused more by English politicians and businessmen realizing they could profit even more from trading with partners who were on a stronger economic footing than by being captured patrons of a corporate state, than by moral outrage over corporate corruption, of which there was plenty. The East India Company was a brutal corporate pioneer that helped define modern business practices in a global market, even though it disbanded more than a century ago. It's hard to understand the global political structure without understanding the role of the company. They transitioned into a modern industrial force and exported their vision of production and governance to the rest of the world, including North America. It's the cornerstone of the modern liberal global political order.